This conference will now be recorded.
Y'all ready?
I'd like to call to order the comprehensive plan worksheet for November 8th, 2022. Our second agenda item is the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Greg, will you do the roll call?
Absolutely. Trevor Dombach.
Present.
Tim Dugan.
Here.
Andrew Flagg. Not here, not online. Brian Height.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
Mark Luth. Not present physically, not online. David Wilson. Not here physically, not online. Monica Hodges.
Here.
David Kennedy.
Here.
Brad Osborne. Not here physically, not online. Mike Walk. Not here physically.
You can remove him from
He
the.
has resigned.
Mhm.
No replacement. We have 4 Planning Commission members, 3 Board of Commission members, both sufficient for a quorum.
Thank you. I also like to acknowledge for those online staff present, which would be Christopher Stroller, our long-range planner, David Manhart, our Director of Community Development, Greg Adams, our Township planner, and Lynn LeBar. Next, the meeting rules. Greg?
These meetings are intended to be a Planning Commission workshop. The goal of these meetings is to complete the Planning Commission's PA-MPC duty to prepare the comprehensive plan for the development of the municipality as set forth in this Act, MPC, and present it for the consideration of the governing body. While it is the role of the Planning Commission to prepare the comprehensive plan, to do so without the input of the Board of Commissioners would ultimately reduce the chances of the Board of Commissioners approving the comprehensive plan. Therefore, any input provided by the Board of Commissioners members will be valuable moving forward with the drafting of the comp plan. For an orderly meeting wherein all attendees may be fully able to participate, we ask you adhere to the following rules. 1, please mute your microphone or telephone to avoid background noise that may cause interference with the meeting and make it difficult for others to hear. Staff may mute microphones of remote attendees if needed. Public questions and comments will be taken at periodic intervals throughout the agenda. We will start with no time limits, but the Planning Commission Chairman may impose a time limitation if there are many questions or if the meeting is running short on time. For in-person attendees, please raise your hand to be recognized, then move to the podium when directed and state your name, address, comment, or question. Please turn the podium microphone on before speaking and off when done. For remote attendees, the chat box feature will be open throughout the meeting. If you have a comment or question, please type your full name and address in the chat box. When you are recognized and so directed, please unmute your microphone and state your comment or question. Mute your microphone when done. For those who are accessing the meeting by phone only, staff will periodically ask for caller comments and unmute any callers. Callers must identify their name and address prior to making a comment. Your cooperation and adherence with these rules will ensure an orderly and respectful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. One other thing I wanted to bring up, could you announce any staff or consultants that are online, just so we know? They know who's here. We would like to know who's online.
Absolutely. Who is online tonight is Herb.
A man.
I'm presuming that's Herb Bender.
He's everywhere.
He
All
is.
right. Okay. Next agenda item is the approval of minutes of the October 11th, 2022 meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes?
Yes, I believe on the second to last page, there's the last comment there. I believe it was Mr. Manhart or Mr. Stroller that made the comment, not myself. You want to look and check? It was the comment that if there's significant changes, that it would put in place the 45-day restart for public comment.
You don't want to take credit for that?
I'm sure it's either one of us and we'll make the change.
Thank you.
I'll make a motion to accept the meeting minutes as amended.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed? And any abstentions? Okay. I just lost my agenda. Hold on. Where is it? There we go. And the next agenda item is the comprehensive plan goals and implementation. I will now turn it over to Dave Manhart, Director of Community Development.
Yes, so tonight we are continuing through the agenda. We did take a pause at land use. We felt, because it's one of the most important parts, we wanted everybody to be on board, comfortable with it. The last thing we want is to go through public comment and have somebody on the board not realize, or something comes up that they didn't realize. So we took a pause and spent a lot of time with individual members. We met with most board members or had direct contact. So I think they were very informative sessions. We learned a lot, as well as I think the people that attended those learned a lot as well. So we're here tonight to hopefully finalize land use, and then go into the implementation plans. If there's any comments on those or things that you feel we should add to that, we will certainly do that. The next steps is, once both of those are ready to go, we incorporate those into the draft plan, and we are essentially ready to go out to public comment. What that brings us to is timeline considerations. We could have the draft complete and ready to go by the next Planning Commission meeting. The Planning Commission could then open it for public comment. That's on the second page of the presentation. So what that does is we could have the Planning Commission could release it for public comment at the next meeting. That pushes the closing of that comment period to January 2nd, and that is over the holidays. So the question becomes, one of the prior schedules we had adoption right around the holidays. So because of the pause, public comment period would be open during the holidays, and whether we think it's a good idea to run it over the holidays or wait and run it after the holidays. So I think that's the big question for the boards to determine when they think it's appropriate to have public comment, either over the holidays or into January, which we would have the 45 days from January. Well, we'd have to get a meeting of the Planning Commission. We'll have to figure that part out, but it would potentially be the Tuesday. First, we could have it at the workshop and open it for public comment in January, which would push it out to mid-February, probably adoption in March.
I have a comment. I think historically, holidays are very busy for people. I think it's a good idea to have it open to the public maybe later in December. I don't know if it's ideal to use mid-November to mid-December as a period where people aren't tied up with everything that's going on end of the year. It's my thought. I would think maybe if we were to open it mid-ish December, so that it is open, in school break and everything. And then it's also into January to allow when things kind of calm down for people.
I agree, especially this year as we come out of COVID. I think there's going to be a lot more parties and traveling, and and I think it would be prudent of us to at least try to capture a good chunk of normal business operations or personal life operations as well. So I agree with Commissioner Kelly I think starting in mid-December would be a better timeline.
Just a quick question, Greg. Once the launch commences at 45 days, in other words, could it go for 90 days, or is it 45? That's what
The MPC requirement is 45 days. I don't know if there's an issue with going longer.
Okay. For transparency, I met with Greg, David, and Chris this afternoon, go over land use. So I made a comment because that came up during our little meeting, and very, very informative meeting. And I thought and tying in with what you're saying, Diane, I said, holidays, and I agree with Brian, people are going to do more this year than in the past. Holidays though, but if you're not doing that, it also gives you a chance to look at something.
Right.
So then by tying it into both the holidays and into January, you kind of capture both. People who may have those holiday parties or travel, and also going into January when school gets back, they're back in town, and it captures both. So if you work your 45 days around a BOC meeting down the road, I think the idea that Brian and Diana agree to is excellent.
I would, if the option is there to roll it out to 55 or 60 days, it, I think could be, call it a good compromise. I would say amongst all the stuff that occurs in the holiday season, I mean, it is a 45-day window. It's covering a lot of November. People see a lot of family and friends this time of year. It'd be a good topic to have. And a lot of people have the opportunity to use vacation time, leave time. I know I typically have a little more downtime, not being at my regular job, but also preparing for family and the holidays, et cetera. If there's an option for 60-day, 55.
I would think that certainly if you're fine with the draft, we could post it to the website, open it up for comment, and then have an official opening per MPC requirements on a specific date. We certainly wouldn't turn down any comments once it's posted to the website.
I don't think it's a problem with the MPC as far as opening it longer, but we can figure that out. But I think it sounds generally like opening it mid-December, and we'll have to figure out whether that's the planning commission or the December workshop, and then figure out the 45 days from there. One of the things that we wanted to do is have a public meeting, like an open house, for the comprehensive plan and the Parks Rec and open space plan. Because the timing is actually coinciding pretty well, where we can have those two kind of discuss both of them and have the Parks and Rec plan as kind of a supplement to the comprehensive plan. So we can kind of demonstrate how all these pieces kind of fit together, and also how the new plans that we're going to work on fit together as well. So that's one of the things we're kind of coordinating right now to see if it's going to work out. So that gives us an opportunity to tackle two at once.
Do you know if there's I'll give you some background. Commissioner Hodges and I both sit on the plan steering committee. I don't think we've identified a date yet.
We have not.
Any movement? Okay.
No. We just had some initial discussions, and I know they're getting close. So we're getting close to the end of the year here with this. So there's a potential opportunity for us to coincide, make those coincide.
If I may chime in here, I also agree with having it a little later. So you have December, January. You have people who are off, who are home, and we don't have a whole lot, we don't exactly have a room full of people now. So you want to give people that extra chance in January as well. So I think that makes sense.
I think we target the December workshop to open it up, and then we'll have the answer of whether we can open it for 60 days or I can't imagine they would not want you to have it open longer. I feel like that 45 days is a minimum, but we can look into that. And then at that December meeting, we'll certainly have the schedule laid out. We can focus on having a public meeting in January.
For reference, if we ask the planning commission to announce it, I think there's a December 15th planning commission, that would put us 45 days at the end of January.
Sounds like that's settled. Thank you. So with that, moving on, again, we wanted to take our time with land use because it's the most important part. And then Chris will go over land use implementation items. One of the modeling conversation, we're kind of, one of the things that we learned from the models is they seem to be more appropriate at a zoning change as opposed to a land use, because the land use, because we keep it so general and the requirements for the inputs to the models are very specific. We may not have that specificity we need for the inputs for the model. But that's something we've talked about internally, and we're kind of going back and forth. And we can certainly bring that up in more detail at the December workshop. But I just wanted to kind of highlight that. And we had talked about running it during the public comment period, but this might also give us some time to flesh out some of our concerns at the staff level and come back with a better idea to present to you guys. So I wanted to mention that because it's on the screen there.
I have I guess just a curious question. Some of the questions and thank you for meeting with all of us and offering that. It was really very helpful for me to have one-on-one and be able to ask questions and dig in deeper. But some of the questions that I asked during the meeting, the answer was that'll be dealt with in zoning. But I always remembered with zoning that the verbiage consistent with the comprehensive plan. And that's where in my mind, since we've met, I've struggled with, well, this is here, it's just a concept. But when we go to zoning, we want it to be consistent with our comp plan. And when I read through some of these things and I think about the questions that have been raised in my mind, and will they drive zoning then? Not drive, but because of the fact that we're going to seek to be consistent with the comp plan, now, in my opinion, is the time to flesh out the questions, because we could potentially end up down the road looking at this comp plan and going down a road of zoning that we may not have intended to. Does that make sense? I think there's some concepts here that we're saying, well, these are nice to think about, but they don't drive zoning. There's that sticky word, consistent.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we, in the meeting with Dave this afternoon, is we talked about how flexible we've built the land use plan by having the concept of the place types and not being very rigid and tying those to specific uses. We allow zoning to be consistent. Pretty much, I mean, there's certain parameters and guidelines that zoning will have to work within, but there's enough flexibility in there for this board, a future board, to make changes that they feel are appropriate and still remain consistent with the comprehensive plan. And that was deliberate. And I think is one of the things that the downside of that is we don't have that specificity that we need to plug into the models. because we don't know, like conservation-based subdivision, it could be an industrial or a light industrial conservation-based subdivision in zoning, but right now we just have it as conservation-based subdivision. Do we put industrial into the model or do we put residential into the model? So those are some of the things that, you know, the flexibility that we built in is great, but then on the other end, having the zone, not having that specificity in the zoning is the problem for plugging into the models. Brian looks like has a question.
I'm just trying to comprehend. Thank you for noticing my, like, you said about putting inputs into the model, and I always go back to transportation, residential, light industrial, warehousing, logistics, manufacturing, two totally different generators.
Yep.
And what model are we going to get? Are they going to run both scenarios, or are they going to?
Well, that's the problem is, I mean, we could run it as the low impact model and say everything's going to be residential and everything will come out smelling like roses, or we could do a high impact model and it's going to be a disaster. And that's why I think if we use it for rezoning, we have that specificity at the rezoning. So if we're going to rezone an area for industrial, we can plug industrial numbers into the model as opposed to, you know, taking a wag at it and just kind of trying to find a number, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm talking in circles a little bit.
No,
I'm sorry.
you flicked my switch. The light bulb went off.
Okay.
But, and then my other scenario, my other question is, like, when we get to zoning, will the model be updated, or like with all the impacts and around us? And
We would certainly do that. Yeah. And there's some things with the model that we have to figure out.
right.
But
And
the
it's
idea
not
is
an exact science.
no, and we always calibrate the model to current conditions before we start. That's kind of modeling 101 is you kind of calibrate it. So all of the development from the last time to this time will be plugged in, and that'll be the new baseline, and then what can plug in the new zoning. And one of the things that we've kind of envisioned for these models is using them more in the future. So rezonings, large developments come in, you know, we can run them through the model, get an idea of what the impacts are. So that's kind of one of the things that we always thought would be a good use of them.
So I feel like we talk a lot about modeling, but I think it's very important. It's a great tool. Who or what would have access to the model? Like developers, private landowners, just us, or is it carte blanche?
It's up in the air. I mean, we'd have to kind of work through those details. Right now,
Because you know, every engineering firm is gonna, that represents somebody in this township is gonna want access.
You know, and the transportation model, I feel like PennDOT scoping meetings is where it'll help. Like if we can plug things into the model and say, all right, we're seeing impacts, you know, 5 miles down this road, and we can bring that information to scoping meetings.
That would be phenomenal, because they're looking at 6 counties where we're looking at 1 municipality.
Right.
You know, the impacts, and they
Right.
rely on the staff here
Yep.
basically to let them know what
Yep.
they should be looking at. So that would be great.
Yeah.
For the future. Yeah. Okay. Sorry that we went down a modeling road, but it's, people think modeling are like, well, what are we doing? But it's very important.
And we can talk about it in more, we'll have more information prepared for that December workshop. We'll
Thanks. Yep.
dedicate that one to modeling, I think.
So kind of moving forward, I think really to Dave's point earlier, we need to nail down this kind of first step in land use in order to kind of look at what we're doing with the model. Up, I have just the, again, directly from the MPC, the purpose of the land use plan, and really that it enables us to start to look at where we're planning for land use, how we're planning for land use. What I wanted to kind of take a moment to talk about, and really to kind of Diane's question, is what is the purpose at this stage with our land use plan, and to highlight that this is really the kind of high level overview of what we want to establish as a framework moving forward, but that we know the land use plan really doesn't change anything on the ground as of today. We could move forward with zoning changes. We could decide to not move forward with certain zoning changes. But really the land use plan gives us that justification for zoning changes in the future. I think really to Diane's point earlier of will this direct zoning changes? I'm not sure about that, but it at least allows us to go back if there is a proposed zoning change and review, does this fit with the vision that we have been developing over the past couple of years here? To me, the land use plan is the vision of all the elements that we've talked about put together, really into more of a geographic landscape, and incorporating tools like the model, incorporating tools like the place types is where we can kind of get to that next step. We talk about the relation to zoning. Again, it's not looked at on a parcel by parcel basis. We want this to help look at how we develop a parcel by parcel basis zoning changes later, but we're really not there yet.
Can I ask one more question based on everything you just said? So whether or not we make zoning changes is going to be dependent on what the township decides to do.
Exactly.
So if this land use map gets adopted as it is from a landowner or a developer's point of view, because it is flexible and there is parameters that are pretty wide, is there room for potential conflict if a zoning change is made by the township, not necessarily totally consistent with what this map says, where a developer might challenge, why does your comp plan show this and you zoned it this way? Because we're broad in the land use map, does that create a potential conflict down the road? That makes sense.
I would say we're broad in the sense of what we are trying to look at on the ground. But for example, if we have in our land use plan, our neighborhood residential area, and there is a change in zoning to say that we want to zone heavy industrial in the middle of our neighborhood residential, I think there would be grounds for someone to challenge that. I think the fact that we are looking at integrating the place types so that we can have some flexibility, but we can also at least understand the type of development that we would want to see on a smaller scale or on a more detailed scale in these broader land use categories. I think that's where we have a better understanding of avoiding conflicts, because the place types are supposed to help us at least establish a general feel for the type of development in these areas.
And if the township makes a recommendation for a zoning change that's not consistent with the comprehensive plan, we will, as staff, point that out. And if we need to make an update to the comprehensive plan, we make an update to the comprehensive plan so that that zoning is consistent. Yeah, our job is to make sure we're consistent. So if we start heading down that path, we'll raise our hands and let everybody know.
And one follow-up, when this draft goes to the public for comment, how are we going to communicate to the residents that this is just the comp plan, and then land use zones will really determine where we end up, and how do we communicate that on the front end for your average citizen who's looking at this for the first time?
I think that's kind of the slide I have up that we've heard very clearly, and I want to thank the board and the planning commission members that have met with us. It's been really helpful for us to kind of walk through this one-on-one with people and recognize that there is the need to kind of lay out the process of where you go from the land use plan to potential zoning updates. And we're cognizant of that now and are looking to kind of spell that out a little bit more in the plan itself. It won't be clear directly just from the map, but this is, the whole chapter of the plan. And that's something that we'd be looking for feedback on as well in the comment period before that's released. But the idea is to show the kind of purpose of the land use plan, where that goes to more detailed zoning updates later on, and highlight how we can kind of bridge that gap with something like place types.
And I just made a note that we should add a page, something along these lines to communicate that in the plan itself.
Thank you.
I also think obviously this is going to be a case of ongoing public education. Certainly if we do get questions, we will answer them, really anticipating the possibilities of few landowners out there not understanding and requiring perhaps a one-on-one very similar to what we did. But I think for the most part, you're going to see that from specific landowners who have a specific vision of development and don't understand how the comprehensive plan works. I think for most other people out there, I don't want to say they don't care enough, but their level of interest is more abstract. So, a simple thing like this, I think, is understandable enough for their area of concern. And certainly, like I said, if we get questions, we will make every opportunity to answer them satisfactorily.
And I think if we see a common theme and, everybody's asking about how do we get to zoning, we can add a page that answers that question, because obviously we didn't communicate that well in the plan because everybody's asking it. So that's part of having that public comment period, is we figure out what the issues are, and if we need to address them in the plan, somehow we can.
I wonder if we could also, if there are a certain theme that comes through, address it in a planning commission workshop or planning commission meeting where you can explain it in depth, and the public can watch the recordings later or come to a meeting and ask questions. I think looking at a meeting and listening to someone speak is a little bit different than the written word if there's something that becomes a common thread.
So Greg has talked about having a talk show. So, so we could
Podcast
or podcast or something where we
A Greg talk.
answer.
Greg talk.
Yeah, Greg talk. Greg talk.
2 Gs.
So making small, short videos
Of answering these common
That's
questions.
excellent. I think it's a great idea.
So dealing with, in my employment, various other communities that have gone down this road either by themselves or with multi-municipal, one group that tends to bang the door first is realtors and people looking to sell their land, and the realtors like, what can we do with this? So, and you're probably by the bobbleheads, it's coming, but that's like, hey, this says industrial, but then there's agricultural in there, and it's like, so I think that's going to be your main driver of the initial questions is our large landowners and then the realtors that are looking to cobble properties together to do something. So.
And I think we mentioned it last time at last month's meeting that We do intend to reach out to the larger landowners and kind of the businesses and the stakeholders that we already can think of who might be more interested in this and have more invested in this, and kind of reach out to them directly to start these conversations. But I do like the idea. I kind of put a note here of just kind of land use planning 101 for the future, whether that's a recording or something, even just a call out in the plan itself.
And so the next step, like after tonight, hopefully everybody's comfortable with land use. That's when we can go out to the stakeholders and the landowners and say, this is where we're headed, and start explaining it, just like we did with all of you. Sit down and explain what it means for their property.
I think one of the uses, the conservation subdivision, I looked up some examples of it in the last couple of weeks, and it goes from very, very dense to a little less dense. And I guess when I was looking at the areas that we've designated for that in the future land use, how are we going to communicate to the public what South Whitehall's vision of what conservation subdivision is?
I think it's different in different areas. And I think that's, when we look to rezone or add conservation-based subdivision to different areas, I think we have the capability to tailor it exactly how we as the township feel it should be. Some places may be more dense and other places may be less dense, based on where they are, what land use type they fall in would kind of dictate that.
Yeah, I think we're more so promoting the idea of conservation-based subdivision, as far as there would be incentives for preserving parts of the land and clustering in other areas. But again, it would be almost looked at in different zones. We would maybe have light industrial conservation subdivision. We might have, medium residential conservation subdivision and so forth.
Thank you.
And just one comment, I mean, Greg brought up today, earlier in our little meeting, was the fact that you got the infrastructure and also utilities into a particular area, which is going to be a driving factor as far as a realtor or anyone to do whatever with that land. So it's going to be a big factor, as we talked about, as I said, the north, and you're calling it the Jordan Valley, where you don't have the sewer systems and water in some cases, without wells. So, and road. So it was a big factor today that came up.
So I think really what we're hearing is the idea of kind of simplifying the process for people in the plan and for the community to be more engaged in what this means from the land use plan as part of the comp plan, and then what that can look like in zoning. Moving us along here, I think I really thank you again to everyone to participate in the one-on-one conversations. We've learned a lot, and it's been helpful to kind of look at the land use categories that we're proposing. Again, up on the screen are the 12 land use place types that we're using interchangeably amongst the land use categories. I think these are helpful for use in the plan, just to give people in the plan itself. We'll have kind of examples, local examples of these types of places. And then this again helps us to look at zoning to go from this very broad concept in our land use categories down to how we actually think about what zoning changes we can make. Again, the goal for land use that we went over last time is to provide a variety of land uses that can be supported by necessary infrastructure, preserve critical resources, and uphold the existing character of South Whitehall.
Can I make one comment on that page?
Yes.
The word can. So should we change that to that will be supported? Because can just means, well, maybe.
I mean, just my interpretation of this is if there are any changes in utilities, that current utilities aren't there, But if there's any changes in zoning, maybe for any utility extensions or anything like that, if we do have extensions of water, public water, then it's not there right now, but that it is possible.
Okay.
But I would leave it up to the board and the planning commission members to change this as needed. The strategies, again, utilizing this land use plan to provide opportunities for growth, but also preserving the framework of the existing neighborhoods. Using the concepts of place types to promote the desired types of development and establish smooth transitions between land uses where appropriate. And utilize the land use plan to inform those updates to the subdivision land development ordinance, zoning ordinance, and the other regulatory documents that we've talked about.
Chris,
Yes, Tim.
in land use strategy 2, when we say development, I know we'd be repetitive, but should it be development or land use? Utilize the concept of place types to promote desired types of land use and establish smooth. However, you could say no development is a type of development.
Right. Like you're preserving a farm is not necessarily a development type. But yeah, we can look at that, whether it's land use or we go through
Or
our
land
planner
use.
dictionary and find something.
Thank you, Tim. Again, here is the existing land use as of today. You can see how the township is broken up primarily as residential, a significant amount of agricultural land, and a fairly significant amount of commercial and industrial. And then the, I'm sorry, Tim, yes.
Read your email. I went through everything.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad, and thank you again for your comments.
Question on existing land use. Should it correspond to current proposed plans that are approved?
This is really just what's on the ground. I think even
It's the current land use plan, yeah.
it's not even the plan. It's just the current land use, the current use of land in the
So
township as
it's
of
a
today.
snapshot in time.
Yeah. Okay.
So
So like specifically like Ridge Farms.
it's showing
is
up
shown
as ag. Yeah.
Well, it's not there
Right.
yet,
Correct.
although 99%
Although it's
chance of being
not-
there.
Yeah. Part of
There
it's
is a small
ag and
possibility
part
it'll
of-
fall apart.
Sure.
And we don't want to make that,
Yeah.
but somebody coming back 15 years later, looking at this and saying, why is that shown high density commercial when it's still open? Yeah.
Yeah, and really this is more just as a reference and a baseline for us, and it'll just be referenced in the plan. The first land use category really is just again kind of an overlay reference of where the natural areas are. This isn't a specific category that we're promoting. This is over top of all the other ones. We have the Jordan Valley, which we talked about last time. This is really our mostly undeveloped areas in the northern tier of the township. Looking for kind of the unique features of this kind of watershed and undeveloped areas. The goals remain the same from last time, and it's really to preserve that rural historic character of the Jordan Valley through a variety of techniques, including preserving natural resources and landscapes. Again, we talked about conservation subdivision, those incentives, continuation of active ag, enhancing some of our kind of rural culture, crossroad villages. So the place type's important here, open spaces, ag, that really, again, that active ag, rural, which is more of our kind of serving, this is more like commercial based, serving our rural community, and then conservation subdivision, again, not specific to a land use type, whether this is industrial, residential, so forth. Yes.
All right, sorry, a couple questions on there. I know we've seen them before, but in line with what some of the previous comments were here tonight about as we roll this out to the public, incentivize and cooperation. Incentivize comes up a lot. And I know this is broad brush, but I guess I have concerns about how's that going to be interpreted. You know, I think behind the scenes, you know, as you look into what exceptions are allowable and adjustments, you know, when there's individual case by case scenarios. But when the average resident reads through this and says, you know, preserve natural resources and landscapes through incentives and cooperation with landowners. I think a lot of people are going to go to like, oh, well,
what does that mean specifically? Yeah. Yeah, I think we can, I mean, maybe we can have a call out of, part of it is we don't want to specify exactly what the incentives will be because we don't really know that yet. It could be very different in different areas. I think a lot of that is done through zoning, but perhaps we can call that out to say incentives as far as allowing density in other areas, or
we can perhaps put parentheses density bonuses, and we can like spell out a few examples just so that we have an example of what an incentive is.
Yeah, but we don't want to tie ourselves to that.
Correct.
As well.
Yeah.
And important landscapes. The how of it really is not been determined yet by the township.
I think the idea of incentives is important because one of the things that we have to balance is property rights.
Mhm.
And the way to balance that is through those incentives. So that's why I feel pretty strongly that incentives needs to be in there so that when we go to zone or come up with other ordinances, we can start building in incentives, and it's very clear that that's why we're doing it, if that makes sense.
That almost, for me, in my thinking, makes me jump over to steep slopes, woodlands, wetlands, protecting them even potentially by ordinance. Should that also be factored in here?
So that would be on the natural resource.
yeah, I think that might actually
Land
be in
use.
the description of, yes, so in the natural areas land use category, we say that these can be protected through those ordinances. And I think these are a little different too, because where the specific natural features, where we're looking to protect specific natural features through ordinance, we're calling those out a little bit more closely as opposed to the other categories looking at development patterns and more parcel-based conversations is where we would look at whether it's, protection through direct acquisition or easements, cooperation with landowners that way, or through the development approach of cluster-based zoning, density bonuses, that sort of thing.
And I think the incentives applies to the land uses, and with the natural areas, there's no incentives. It's protected by ordinance.
Mhm.
So that's a distinction
Okay.
between the two.
I think it's important because almost flipping it around from Tim's concept. His is how does the average resident understand some of these things? I think if you remove the incentives from there, you get from a concern from the specific landowners if they're not seeing an incentive there. If I were one of them and I saw only preserve this stuff, my mind would jump to by ordinance. And to include the incentives means that, yes, there will be some benefit to me for losing some of my rights. I will gain benefits that way, thus retaining my profitability of land and forestalling any challenges.
And I think that's why we also were direct with the cooperative language there of if landowners are, it's a willing program to look at direct protection and instead of a requirement. I think just to avoid the concerns there with someone picking this up and seeing, I have 20 acres in the Jordan Valley. The township is proposing that I won't be able to do anything with that. That'll just be
Right, yeah, we're certainly not
acquired.
doing that. Yeah, thank you.
Currently, there are incentives outlined in the ordinances and zoning and Saldo now, right?
Yes, but we are looking at adding more. And then, of course, tailoring them to the outcomes that the township wants.
I have one other. It's more just a good agreement. The Crossroad Villages, I think it's a good point to have that held in here. Maybe even as a little bit of a counterbalance to other development outside of these areas that would have an impact to the Crossroad Villages, especially like traffic planning, et cetera, because those crossroads are pretty tight to begin with.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. We really like the Crossroad Village concept and carrying that forward through this. The other thing that we're trying to promote with this is again, like kind of where it says the attention to the surrounding landscape, how this might come into play when we're looking at zoning of some of these crossroad villages and how they get developed and how maybe some of the surrounding areas more preserved, whether it be the landscapes or even looking at kind of the transportation networks leading to that crossroad village. So it might be a smaller area that can't take a lot of transportation. So that affects kind of the zoning down the road. Any other questions with Jordan Valley? I threw in just kind of an example of conservation subdivision as one of the newer concepts, and this is something we'll certainly explore in the plan itself. Just to kind of quickly run through what you have here. It's the same site. To the left, you have the site under current kind of traditional zoning, 80,000 square foot lots, utilizing a lot of the property spread out, larger lot sizes. To the right, the same property, the same yield of 34 house lots, that with the clustered approach, smaller lot sizes, you're preserving approximately 50 acres in whether it be open space available for the HOA, public open space connected. And there's a lot of great examples of conservation subdivision out there, again, that we would tailor specifically to the areas that we would zone, whether it be industrial, residential, and to different varieties.
So that map will be in there?
Possibly this example or others.
I would suggest, I'm just speaking for myself, that you don't put road names or put very generic, because somebody's going to Google this and try to look to see trust me, they're going to try to find out where, Yeager's Mill Road is, or Roarsville, and it's not in South Whitehall.
Yeah.
You have an out-of-town consultant, and even though we did it ourselves, trust me, it's try to, either put it as road A or to be determined road, or, just a generic road or something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of very good, clear local examples. I know of some good examples in Chester County that we can kind of show that are completed, subdivisions that have been completed that have used this type of approach, a specific zoning approach. There's good examples of conservation subdivision just because, but
Going back to the 2009 plan, there was a lot of images that do not reflect South Whitehall. So we need to try to, even if we have to create something ourselves, or just, yeah, there's,
if we
we don't
need
want to
to
be like, oh, they're trying to bring Philadelphia here or New York here or Carbon County here. We're South Whitehall and we're the Lehigh Valley. So just food for thought.
Do these two maps have the same number of dwellings,
yes.
same density as far as?
Well, no, the overall.
Overall.
Well, if that was 10 acres and there's how many lots, or 70 acres, and then preserves 50 acres. So you could put the same amount of houses there, but it's just the size of the lots and the more open space, potentially.
Was there a commercial option for this place type too?
Yes. So we could potentially have light industrial conservation-based subdivision. So rather than having 30 industrial lots on, I'm going to have to do quick math here, on 100 acres, we could have those 30 on 50 acres of it and have 50 acres preserved. It could be the rural crossroads village, could be a piece of this. So you'd have a clustered village type setting surrounded by open space. So there's a lot of options with conservation-based subdivision. And it's kind of exciting to be able to start investigating and presenting some of those options with them.
Do we have that defined? I'm sorry if I missed it. Because I know we've talked about it one-on-one in a group. But I like when people hear subdivision, a lot of people go to this picture, kind of residential.
Yeah.
They don't think like, oh, there's commercial, you could do light industrial too. That may, in the current climate, may surprise some people.
We don't have a lot of local examples, but there are
Totally.
there are examples out there of industrial, and
I think if we do a diagram, a sketch ourselves, we can just call it unit or building.
Yeah, something
then
just, or either clear up that there's multiple options, not just residential for conservation. That's my only comment.
yes, Monica.
Hi, I have a question for you, and please forgive me, this is not anywhere in my wheelhouse. So when a conservation subdivision example, like what we have here, when it is zoned, is it zoned as a conservation subdivision, or will it be zoned another name, or?
I think, so the example here on the left, that is probably a rural residential zoning that was existing in this example. And then by applying the new zoning type of conservation zoning, where the municipality is requiring or incentivizing that in that area, the residential lots are to be clustered. They are to, the site plan is supposed to look at some of the existing natural features first, and that they are allowed maybe a bonus in what they're required as far as frontage improvements or something like that. That is a different zoning change. And that's where we would look at our existing zoning districts, where we might have a rural residential zoning district in a specific area. And we would see this is because of the natural resources that are there, because we want to look at more cluster types of developments, that we don't want to just be open like that, that we might look at either a conservation subdivision zone, or even the idea I think that we've talked about is it's an option.
One of the things we talked about is making it a use in the use schedules. So we have conservation-based subdivision. If you go through our zoning portal, you'll see all the uses that are allowable, and conservation-based subdivision is allowable in these zones. And it would probably end up being like residential cluster-based subdivision and light industrial cluster-based subdivision. They may be separate use types. There's different ways to do it. The idea of putting a conservation-based overlay on different areas is another way to handle it. So there's a couple things that we have to really work through to kind of figure out the best place. I think the easiest way is to just add a use to the use schedules. Something that we could probably crank out a lot quicker than doing a whole zone change.
And that's not unusual. We currently have something like that in our zoning ordinance now. We call it lot averaging. It's called lot averaging.
So out of all the land uses, is residential allowed in all of them?
As far as zoning or in
This scheme, or like I was looking at the land use place types.
it's some level of residential, I believe so.
I think industrial might be the only one where it's not called out.
Well, it's got conservation subdivision in it. So,
Right, and that could just be, it could be either residential or.
I'm just
Yep.
asking.
Yep.
And I mean,
It gives it flexibility.
yeah, and we weren't too direct on it's more of promoting what we'd like to see in these areas, so that when we look at zoning, it's okay, do we maybe consider adding a type of zoning in one of these areas that's non-existent now, or does it make sense to look at rezoning something because it doesn't really fit within the other place types that we're promoting.
Okay.
Rural residential really is the filling in the gaps in the Jordan Valley. This is where we have kind of existing residential neighborhoods. We have the ability to have larger lot residential developments. There's stub streets here. Some areas do have water access. There's not any sewer access here existing. And really, again, we're kind of promoting a lot of the same things we are in the Jordan Valley. And this is also highlighting the kind of connection between active agriculture, working farms, and rural areas, and continuing the existing development in a seamless manner, so that we're looking at where these rural residential areas kind of bridge the gap between maybe working farms, open space areas, but then also some of our neighborhood developments. So you'll see. Yeah.
And just a comment with the agriculture, we've kind of identified different types of agriculture because an active pig farm isn't appropriate next to residential. So we kind of have, and I forget exactly what we put in, but the concept of a vineyard is more appropriate next to a residential subdivision than an active pig farm. So we kind of identified some of these different types of agriculture. We talked about farmettes is the other one. So CSA, community supported agriculture, farm with a stand is appropriate next to residential. So we kind of lumped these other agricultural uses into that agricultural place type. And that's some of the flexibility that we're talking about in these place types.
Neighborhood residential covers really most of the township because these are established neighborhoods. And again, it's just kind of promoting the continuation of those neighborhoods. This is where we see a lot of different place types. We heard comments back from the kind of individual meetings. Obviously, the idea of looking at small lot residential, which is consistent with a lot of our neighborhoods, but including the idea for conservation subdivision here, in case we do want to see those more clustered types of developments. We included agriculture here as well, where it makes sense. We do have some locations where you could look at existing agricultural lands more in the fringes of our neighborhoods, where you could actually see the protection of a farm that is in this general area where it's, it has utilities, it has connections to neighborhoods, but it would be allowed that it could remain a farm. And then we have kind of our multifamily residential, mixed residential, which are place types promoting different types of residential uses. Neighborhood corridor is one of the newer concepts. You'll see here the roadways that are highlighted as neighborhood corridor. You have Walbert on really either side of the next land use category, which is our business district. Basically, these corridors are connecting the residential areas to our business districts. If they have gaps in them that you'll see in the next slides, that's where we have identified more of our commercial business district. And the idea here is really to kind of promote the transition between residential areas, locally serving commercial areas, kind of your more neighborhood-based stores and businesses, identifying more of the Main Street type of feel, very walkable, very welcoming, allowing for better pedestrian access. And it's, again, that kind of transition between existing neighborhoods, existing residential areas as they start to get into more commercial.
And they also serve as, I like the idea of the spine of the neighborhood. So it's kind of the focal point for these neighborhoods that surround those corridors. Some of the comments that came up were, gateways and like streetscape and banners and things like that, where it's the focal point of the community or the neighborhood. So that's really the other piece of these neighborhood corridors.
Yeah, and I think it's important to show, all of these areas that we've identified. So for example, there's Walbert all through there and Cedar Crest and Broadway. And these are all areas where you have existing residential and commercial integration. And for the most part, there is a good balance there. And the idea of these corridors, I wouldn't call them an overlay, but it is just highlighting for us to pay attention to preserving that kind of balance in our areas where we have this nice integration of the two land use types. And when it comes to zoning changes, we can think about these as a larger corridor, whether it be through even more maybe transportation planning related, of kind of the walkability of some of these areas and connecting some of these corridors, but also looking at making sure that we're promoting zoning changes that fit within a more seamless transition between existing maybe single family homes and more of a neighborhood commercial type of zone, as opposed to conflicts of land use types.
Just can I make a comment on these? I appreciate the look and the accommodation to have more pedestrian access in these areas, but as someone who travels Cedar Crest and Walbert fairly often, they are very, very busy corridors, very congested. And once the development at the corner of Cedar Crest and Walbert is built out, I imagine those areas will see a little bit more traffic. And I know recently we've seen some very unfortunate accidents locally where pedestrians were struck by a vehicle and did not survive. So when I look at this, a couple of things come to mind. As you said, transportation improvements and how do we protect residents who might want to walk in these areas, knowing that they are congested now. The other thought that comes to mind is on Walbert, going more towards the Greenwalds area. There are some historic homes there, and I don't see that we've included here, and maybe it's somewhere else, to preserve the historic. I don't necessarily mean by ordinance, but how do we help encourage and preserve the historic structures that are there and celebrate them and find a way to integrate small business within so that it keeps that neighborhood feel. Those are just a few of the thoughts that I've had as we look at this.
Yeah, I think a lot of those outside of this particular category, this category is just on the roadways where we have commercial and residential together. I think Greenwalds, for example, there's not a lot of commercial there already, and that's highlighted more in preserving the character of the neighborhood in the previous place type. I'm sorry, in the previous land use category. To me, this is where we look at, for example, some of the homes on Walbert, people that live there wanting to get to maybe like Sims Market, for example, and to identify the need for that locally serving business to the local areas that are there, even though Walbert is a pretty heavily used transportation route. What are we doing to make sure that we can kind of protect the pedestrian use that could occur there on a daily basis? So it's more just kind of highlighting these areas of, they're a little different than in existing neighborhoods. They're a little different than, say, Cedar Crest and like Winchester, for example, where you have a lot more commercial activity, a lot more traffic through there. A lot of, in and out of some of the more regional use. And this is looking at what's existing as opposed to what can really be developed.
And another piece of this is, I think in one of the other previous meetings, I had ped shed analysis, where you look at how far a pedestrian can walk unobstructed, and you typically use a quarter mile. And one of the concepts here, and when we start looking at rezoning and looking at lot by lot, that's where we can identify, what is that walking distance? Does it make sense to have different pockets of commercial with more residential in between? Are there historic structures in between? What types of adaptive reuse can we encourage in those structures? So I think it's when we get into rezoning it, we have an opportunity to look at it on a lot by lot basis and determine, where, if we have a cluster of 5 existing businesses, does it make sense to make that a little bit bigger and then leave it more the residential character until we get to the next pocket? So it could be like these little pockets. But again, that comes in when we start looking at the rezoning.
So would we be calling in sidewalk deferrals, although some are older and might be waived?
So one of the, in when we get to implementation is in the active transportation plan is to prioritize sidewalk deferrals. That was one of the learning teachable moments was when we went through that sidewalk deferral is we need to have some sort of prioritization and how those things fit in a broader plan. So that's, these corridors are priority pedestrian corridors. So anything we can do to get sidewalks in there and get people off the road is priority.
And then secondarily, they might want to cross over Walbert from one side to the other, not just stay on one side. And is this something that we will look at in partnership with PennDOT and Lanta to make safe passage across the road and across even the side streets? Because I've even seen with the development here, the hills at Winchester, there's a lot of people that live there that cross Walbert to walk in the neighborhoods. And it's 45 miles an hour there, and people don't stop for people in the crosswalk.
And that's, I think, identifying these as corridors in the comprehensive plan is another tool that we have when we go to PennDOT to talk about, these have been identified in our comprehensive plan. What can we do in cooperation with you to identify some of these pedestrian concerns?
And not to get too far ahead here, but for sidewalk call-ins, maybe for someone that has lived there for 20 years and we're going to call it in, is there any help with transportation grants or anything that we could assist homeowners who might suddenly be faced with something they never thought they'd have to have?
That's something we absolutely will want to look into. There's some, yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's been rattling around in there for a while.
I think that goes back to kind of the active transportation plan as well. Part of that is looking at, we might look in the active transportation plan and try to highlight a piece of one of these corridors together instead of maybe individual sidewalks, individual intersections. The purpose of planning them here and then planning them within the active transportation plan is identifying really where our high use areas are, where our major intersections that need safety improvements for pedestrian access. And it allows us the ability to kind of aggregate a lot of this stuff together to maybe look at a larger grant or a larger initiative that would allow us to do more in one shot instead of looking at one sidewalk deferral here and one small improvement when there's a development that comes in that we already have the justification that this these 5 blocks are high priority pedestrian corridors that we want to tackle.
And then, I'm sorry, one last comment. I said it was last. Some of these might be on township roads, the smaller roads, and then will we be putting together a plan so we understand the financial impact to the township if we were to move forward with these particular neighborhood corridors?
The short answer is yes. At this phase, really the corridor concept is just in the land use. Really, this is more directed towards development types, design standards, the zoning changes. In the active transportation plan or in the transportation plan and active transportation plan, that's where we will look at more of the specific locations and what we need to do there, how we will do it, and how we will fund it.
Well, thank you. That was why I'm asking. I think one of the things we've talked about is making this an implementable plan. And personally, I'm looking for the big picture of how we pull this all together and look at the financial impact as well as the impact on the residents.
Hopefully we can kind of breeze through the rest of the land use so that we can actually go through some of those implementation items. And so we've talked a lot about neighborhood corridor. What's that?
I want to go back to the corridor.
To corridors, okay.
So yeah, I know we're spending time, but it's very important. I go back to their 309 Betterment project and why isn't Orfield on this? There's a mix of everything.
I think we have that in as a crossroads village.
Okay.
So but we don't have
Can we have it as both?
I think really
Corridor goes across multiple maps.
Yeah, the hope was here, even though Cedar Crest is on there, we tried to highlight Cedar Crest where there was a lot of existing residential, where it's primarily residential. But that, I believe, is the only state road that we've highlighted, whereas 309 is kind of its own bear.
Well,
Walbert Avenue is a state
Walbert
route.
State.
Oh, yeah.
Right,
Yeah, it's like our major
Yeah. So-
east-west corridor.
The other reason we use these neighborhood corridors is because they're in neighborhood residential. So they're kind of that spine of neighborhood residential. So they're serving the immediate neighborhood.
And
And
Orfield's not a neighborhood?
Orfield, we categorize as a rural village.
Okay.
So I think your point is pedestrian, like
It's
looking at
multimodal.
multimodal, looking at it, and
Like if PennDOT's coming in there and digging up the road,
yes, we
it would
need
be
to
great
get,
to have this identified so they can
Yes.
say, hey, this is a vision. It's on a piece of paper.
yes.
We need
And I
to
think
really look
that
at this.
that's where the active transportation plan comes in. And we identify it on that. Because I don't think we have it. I don't think it's a big enough neighborhood for us to justify calling it neighborhood residential and then having a neighborhood corridor in the middle of that. So that's kind of why we left it. And it's also not served by sewer was the other reason we didn't include it in neighborhood residential.
It depends on what goes on with the.
And that
Parkland High
depends,
School, or
yes.
the old Parkland, the Orfield Middle
Yes.
School sewage
Yes.
plant and
Yes.
the potential for that to expand rapidly.
So the other piece of these corridors is they were built off of the next land use category of, I believe is neighborhood commercial. And the idea was where we're proposing neighborhood commercial, we have areas that outside of that need some better connection to it. In Northfield, we're not proposing any neighborhood commercial outside of that. And I think that's really where it just didn't come up in, these are kind of extensions of our, or the business district. Thank you.
Okay. Moving right along. There's something else.
I guess to that point, I go back to Tillman and Parkway. I know it's near 309, but there's residential and commercial, but we don't have that as a corridor.
We included Tillman, pretty much all of Tillman in the township in our business district.
But didn't you just say neighborhood corridor? You were trying to correlate to the.
Yeah, because there's so much existing commercial around Tillman, like right through here. Is this where you're talking about? This is Tillman
Yeah.
coming off of 78.
So it was plugged into the business district because it has more of a regional draw. So it's more of a regional serving commercial. And the idea of the neighborhood corridor is it's more local serving. So smaller business, not necessarily the chains and the bigger commercial pieces.
Yeah, I guess I can see that. I think about the school at
Ye-
Parkway and Tillman.
Yeah,
It's just
and
that there's a lot going on there. And you talked
And
about pedestrian
active
connectivity,
transportation plan.
which we've talked a lot about.
Yes,
That's a great point.
it's definitely
putting
going to
in-
be.
Yeah, I think we want to.
This is the time, but having something around crosswalks and pedestrian friendly next to schools.
I want to make the distinction, just the neighbor, if something is not in a neighborhood corridor, it doesn't mean we're not going to look at it from a pedestrian multimodal accessibility standpoint. And I think if anything, that we'll look at that a lot more closely, even in some of these neighborhood corridors in the active transportation plan. The idea here is more of the compatible land use types as opposed to infrastructure. And it's built off of the transitions between neighborhoods, the larger business districts, and then kind of that in between of locally serving neighborhood main streets. Whereas pedestrian activity is a part of the neighborhood corridor. It's not exclusive to the neighborhood corridor.
And when we do active transportation, one of the things that we do is we identify draws. So like a school, a business district, church, library, those things. And then we look at connectivity to those areas and identify sidewalks or gaps and things like that as part of that plan.
So again, just to kind of highlight the Dave, did you have a question? Were you raising? Okay. To highlight the business district, again, this is more of our kind of regional draw. This is where we have good connections to larger roadways. This is, we have employment opportunities here. We have larger commercial ventures. And this is kind of a hot spot for activity. Some of the goals here were, again, incentivizing infill, redevelopment. We have areas that, we have a lot of existing commercial, but we certainly have areas that we can look at some redevelopment and rehabilitation of some of these areas. Incorporating residential where it makes sense to have more mixed uses. Local connectivity and regional connectivity. Transit is big here from an employment standpoint, and just better circulation of our shoppers and so forth. And then really the last one is industrial. Pretty self-explanatory. Some of the things we've talked about here, again, including the conservation-based subdivision as a place type, so that we can look at that within conservation-based subdivision for industrial uses. Making distinctions between light and heavy industry, encouraging or really requiring buffers, and again, kind of our identifying transportation routes. A lot of this using the transportation plan, looking at we've talked about truck routes a lot. We've talked about transit connections. I think the only other thing that through our one-on-one meetings we've heard or we might have included is the idea of agriculture. We might have some locations in this area that could still be preserved as agriculture, even though they're still in that larger industrial category.
And another thing that came up during some of the conversations, if you can go back to the map real quick, is the corner where we are now and down Ridgeview, taking that out of industrial and putting it into neighborhood residential, but so basically running it down Ridgeview. So the Bulldog side with the truck terminals and the truck repairs facilities stays industrial, but we cut out Town Hall and make that neighborhood residential.
And there's really everything together in a nice, pretty land use map. Before we move into implementation, was there any other comments or questions on land use in general? The idea is we're hoping to get kind of consensus on these concepts that we've been discussing, the uses as they are, so that we can put this together and get this into the draft plan, because this really kind of is the final piece of what we need to have this ready to go for public comment, and nailing down the land use is important for us to look at, again, kind of the use of our modeling, how we prioritize some of the implementation items in the future, whether that's in, looking at zoning updates or some of the ordinances that we've talked about.
I would guess that you guys might have done this, or you all might have done this. But was there like a comparison percentage-wise based from the existing different land use types, which to the proposed or the future? I know they don't line up.
Yeah.
But they clump together from the existing to the proposed.
Honestly, and I think we looked at a lot of this in kind of our one-on-one meetings. There's not a lot of change in the existing land use and what we're proposing as far as, you know, general concepts of residential, open, and so forth. What we're showing is it's really the themes in these areas. So for example, you have, you know, Jordan Valley, almost everything in green is undeveloped. It won't remain that way. So that's where, as an existing land use type, it's undeveloped. And so we're highlighting the Jordan Valley as a land use category so that we can show what types of development could or could not occur there.
And the big difference is existing land use category. One of the land use categories is agriculture, and agriculture is kind of baked into the land use. So that's the piece that's where the change is. So one of the things we did with the individual meetings is we kind of went through those areas that are currently ag, and we didn't change the land use because we're probably identified that land use in the 2009 plan, but we overlaid a residential land use most times. And the reasons we would do that is if it had access to utilities, if it is adjacent to existing residential, if there's an existing stub street connecting to that agriculture. So those are reasons that we would have taken the existing land use of ag and made it a residential. Is the primary reason. There was one spot where there's existing ag that is industrial. That's because it's kind of surrounded by industrial. So those are really the changes, and they're, I don't know if they're really considered changes, but
there's not much to justify, or there's not much to really look at as far as saying it direct change, because it's we're looking at what's on the ground now, and in the places where there isn't any development, or even the places where there is development, it's another good example is we have, you know, these neighborhoods that are existing, but in these land use categories, we're also promoting, you know, infill development, redevelopment, and it's sort of setting the tone for what, you know, changes could occur there or not occur there. So,
and just because it's identified as residential doesn't mean that it's going to be residential, because we have agriculture, conservation-based subdivision in those land use types. So if we have the incentives, we're going to end up with conservation-based subdivision. So we're going to preserve that agricultural land where we can. And that's, again, some of that flexibility that we built into these land use categories.
And I think I want to also point out here, there's a great difference between the future land use map, zoning, and the actual use of the property. Just take an example, for those of you who remember the Hillview rezoning. You're taking an area that is currently ag. Right now under this, it's a neighborhood residential, which due to the place types can either be agriculture, open space, multifamily residential, mixed residential. So you can have all of those. So you move into rezoning, that's when you look at it in a more granular fashion, decide, okay, well, what's appropriate for those few parcels is X. So that would be the zoning of it. But in the end, you can zone it that, but it may indeed remain agricultural for the next 50 years because there's no change. So,
And
so there's a big difference between the current land use, what the future land use map portrays, what the future zoning could be, and what the actual future use could be.
there's something just popped into my head, and if this makes sense, we can maybe build on it. But the idea of rezoning a property, you can kind of think of yourself as a painter, and the palette that you have is the land use. And within that land use, the paints on the palette are your place types. So when we go to rezone, we pick the place type and put it on the map, and that's our rezoning. I don't know, it made sense in my head.
Picasso.
I think, yeah, I've seen several examples of land use plans as part of a comprehensive planning process that they might have a lot more detail in, that it makes it easier for comparison. Say you might have like 14 different land use types existing, and then when you go through the update, you're updating 14 different land use types, some of them remaining the same, some of them changing, and it's easier to see that direct comparison. I think what's really hard here in not only the comparison to our existing land use of what's on the ground, and even when we talk about 2009, which is kind of, a completely different approach, is the idea of using really, what do we have, the 5, 6 general land use categories set to be very broad with options within them, because we have a lot of options in these larger areas. It makes it difficult to look at now of what we see the change, but the hope is that it'll actually make it a lot easier when we get to a zoning discussion. Whereas if we had a much more detailed land use plan now, if we never made a zoning change, that land use plan is useless, because we wouldn't be able to actually encourage, enforce, or regulate what our land use plan had proposed. And I think too, it offers us a flexibility for changing development, or changing a lot of these things as development pressures change, as types of development that we might see more popular come into the area. Global pandemic is a good example of, how do we adjust to make sure that we're providing what the vision that we've heard from the community in an area that we can actually kind of see changes on the ground over time. I'd like to actually just kind of go down the line and hear from everyone if you have any comments on this, because we've talked a lot about land use over the while. So Tim, unless you had any other questions or comments on land use.
I'm good with it.
Okay. Trevor.
I'm good, thanks.
Okay. Brian.
I'm still struggling with the neighborhood corridor concept. I don't know how you implement that. Is it like just frontage parcels and there's like a little dot, I think it's on Whitehall Avenue. I'm not sure what commercial's up there.
I think
it's just at the fire company. I don't know. It just seems disjointed. So
I think a good example, just in that little area between Walbert and Cedar Crest and the end of Walbert outside as it leaves the township, I think we have about 6 or 7 different zoning districts already. And I see probably still a need for, half a dozen zoning districts within there. The idea here is that those zoning districts are compatible with each other. And when we're looking at Walbert as a, quote unquote main street, it allows us for more cohesive, maybe like streetscaping design or pedestrian connectivity. It allows us to look at all of our Atlanta stops there a little bit more closely, even though we'll see different, levels of zoning as far as, intensity of commercial development, preservation of kind of the existing residential or the types of residential we want to see. I think we included the little stretch onto Whitehall Ave because you'll see one of the place types that we're promoting there, I believe, is that the multifamily residential, where you have the opportunities to have more small scale multifamily types of residential development, like duplexes, triplexes. We have some like very small apartment buildings through there. And that's kind of a place type that we are encouraging as part of this neighborhood corridor, because those fit well in those kind of neighborhood types.
I think this applies to neighborhood corridor, and any land use is we're identifying it as a future land use to open the book to look at whether we want to rezone it or not. So by identifying it on the map, we're saying that it's worth looking into. Whether we make a change or don't make a change, that's up to us, up to the boards.
But does that close the door to other corridors such as Parkway and Tillman?
No.
So that's where I'm struggling, because he's got a lot of value in what he said. Because you have the county fields to the south, near the Saturnia building.
But I wouldn't want to identify Parkway as a neighborhood corridor, because we have, I don't know that it's appropriate for commercial and small businesses, which is probably why I didn't think of it.
Yeah, it really is where, and again, it's where we have existing commercial and residential together. I think that's where, because we were even wondering on Broadway, like where we kind of make the stop on Broadway, and we sort of ended it at, I believe the Red Cross there and the fire company.
Yeah, the curve,
Yeah.
basically.
And again, that may justify a zoning change, it may not, but it's just for us, again, the 100,000 foot view looking at is these are areas that we want to pay special attention to because of their connectivity, their integration between different land use types, so that we can, when it comes down to, more land use type decisions, zoning changes, development types of changes, we can see them in more of a linear fashion.
Okay. I don't want to see us close the book on any potential. And I don't want somebody, when we go into the active transportation or traffic plan, whatever transportation plan, well, they're saying a corridor, it's not a priority.
I think we'll probably have
in this township.
I would see it as coming out of that plan. I see Parkway being a priority pedestrian corridor. Coming out of that plan.
Yeah, I think
neighborhood corridor, I don't see it because of that lack of existing commercial.
Well, there's commercial on both sides of Parkway, just south of Tillman.
Yeah, and
you have the bank and you have the
that's business district.
Village in west or whatever.
Right.
All right. I'm just, you asked for feedback.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I'm really struggling with, and I might lay it tonight or tomorrow at work, and click.
The theme for all of these land use types is really to be to have a lot more flexibility, to be open to new types of uses.
And I appreciate that. It's a very valuable tool to have that flexibility rather than a hard set guidelines. And then you boxed yourself in. And we don't want to box ourselves in, because as the pandemic and everything else, we've learned to adapt and change. And who knows if any of this is even going to be built ever.
Yeah,
who
exactly.
knows?
Yeah, and then I think, again, with the active transportation plan, I see really a lot more. I mean, there will be a lot more corridors. I can guarantee that in even what we've seen just from
I'll be very involved, trust me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will heed my time to Diane.
Thank you.
Well, Brian hit on some of my concerns or my thoughts on this. Trevor, thank you for bringing up Parkway. Is it Dillon Drive that first? Okay, so I heard comments from some of the neighbors that live right on Dillon as it intersects with Parkway because they like to take their pets across the road into that subdivision across the street. And they shared with me how difficult it is to cross Parkway. People are just flying by. I know it's a speeding issue and separate, but I guess most of the comments I've heard already tonight, I don't think as a whole we've looked at our township in its entirety. And I have shared with you my thoughts with these particular corridors being chosen. I would like us to be very deliberate and careful about what we would even consider looking at. They're high traffic corridors now, and if we're going to even consider any increase in the intensity of what we would allow on a commercial basis, I wouldn't even want to go down that road. And my reason is those, Walbert down by Sims and Cressman Insurance and the Kiffle Kitchen, they've done a marvelous job of adapting commercial into those areas just organically, and they fit. And I think sometimes when we go in there with our tools, we create things that maybe don't naturally fit. And I'm very cautious as we look at this. And the same thing with Broadway, especially over there, that turn 3501, there's no sidewalk there. The houses are very close together. They're beautiful homes with a lot of character. The church is there. How do we, bigger question, but put sidewalks and move people efficiently if we're going to try to encourage more commercial development there? It's going to create more pedestrians, and I don't want to see us create another problem. Anyway, I think overall, I thank you all for your work and input. Thank you for listening to all of us and allowing us ample opportunity to share our thoughts and concerns and factoring them in as you've done this and put this together for us. I'm okay with it, but I'm very much wanting to keep an eye on these neighborhood corridors.
If I can make two comments that I think might help ease some of your concerns. One of the implementation items that I'm most excited for is the active transportation plan. I can guarantee you Parkway is probably the #1 road that I think we'll be looking into there. Really almost all of Parkway, from Tillman up to Walbert, for a number of reasons. Again, just to kind of make that distinction between there isn't existing commercial on there. That's why we're not considering it in this neighborhood corridor land use type, because that's more in how the development occurs, where we're not really seeing any new development along Parkway or in that area. That would be more specific to the implementation of the active transportation plan, whether it be sidewalks and looking at maybe traffic calming and things like that. The concept of neighborhood corridor is not necessarily to, promote more of something. It's not really to promote more commercial in areas. It's not to increase necessarily the intensity of commercial. I see it as helping us when we're looking at zoning, considering parking requirements on some of these areas may be different than parking requirements in some of the zones elsewhere, that we want to encourage more walkability instead of traffic connection. A good example is really just in like the dotted area versus the red area. We might have specific parking requirements for some of our businesses in our commercial zones. Do we consider a different type of commercial zoning in some of these along Walbert, for example, that we don't want to encourage more single vehicles there, that we want to encourage, small parking areas in the back and better access to transit and sidewalk requirements. The other aspect, I think, comes back to the design of some of these areas where we're not looking at, I think, Broadway is a good example of that. That it's not just a singular, development where we might require one sidewalk, that again, we might look at a longer stretch of that as needing pedestrian access between one commercial type and another commercial type, or residential areas that are, just by nature of having connections to commercials, that we might see an increase in pedestrian traffic.
And I think the other piece is the implementation. Some of these implementation items may add to informing zone changes. So we may get through this active transportation plan and the Broadway neighborhood corridor. We may say it's ripe for traffic calming, or different things may come out of it that may trigger us to rezone. Another piece with the corridors that kind of just popped into my head as Chris was talking is I see these as applying design standards so that we can maintain that kind of quaint village along Broadway and the restaurant there, using design standards. So, really focusing that in these areas is another piece of that.
One side
And,
question, the Walbert west of Cedar Crest. So how did that get chosen? There's no commercial that I know
I was
of.
going to piggyback on that from
well,
Ridgeview to Springhouse Road.
It's all
no,
residential.
There's
the restaurant proposed at the Regency. Well, not proposed, approved.
Is it built?
No,
It may never be built.
it may never be built.
So one commercial
So
parcel
no,
triggers that whole
No.
corridor.
no,
So,
no.
uh,
What triggers that corridor is it's the spine of the neighborhood and it's the spine of the community.
like Parkway.
I think
I don't feel it kind of
we
comes
have
back around.
with lack of a main street in South Whitehall, we really don't have one main street. We've kind of looked at Walbert serves as a main street, whether that be a main street through a residential area, main street through kind of a mix, kind of between Cedar Crest and the edge of town there. And it might be the difference is especially for that corridor, we look at more of the gateway approach. There's a lot of people that come through that area, whether they're coming to the Township building, whether they're going to Cedar Crest, Walbert, that whole area, Crest Plaza. And that's where we can look at kind of the unifying of our kind of linear corridor in one main street, whether that be through streetscaping, beautification projects, that sort of thing. So it might not necessarily do anything to change the zoning in that area, but it allows us as a township to look at that a little bit more closely. And, how do we welcome people to this building? How do we kind of encourage more of a welcoming small town feel in an area that we don't have a general main street? Walbert really is kind of our main street.
See, I'm sorry. I feel like we're like really crushing this topic, but for me, I only come on Walbert if I'm coming to the Township building. I go to the Target shopping center on Cedar Crest. I cut down Parkway to Springhouse and then I don't even go up to Walbert. I cut in the back way to White.
Winchester.
So I guess and I think why we're all struggling with this is because we don't have a main street. Like I'm originally from Lidditz.
Yeah.
We legitimately have a main street, and I understood, like, I get the neighborhood corridor thing. Like, to me, neighborhood corridor, Lidditz, it's 501 and Main Street. period. That's it.
It's called Main Street.
Yeah.
Right, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So,
there's a tension focus there
There's
as far as
square, yeah,
lighting and
100%.
hanging things on the.
I get it.
Yeah.
But I don't see personally, I just don't see Walbert as even our future Main Street. Just from the population is not there. And I don't, to me, I get like Walbert and Cedar Crest with Ridge Farm, but I just
I think
don't.
22 is Wilbur is a 22 bypass.
Yeah.
That's what I use it as. Instead of a 22, it's packed. When 22 is backed up, it's all Wilbur.
So I mean, that's why I'm struggling with it, because I'm just confused on, I think there's a lot of main streets because quote unquote main streets. And I see neighborhood, the term neighborhood, I think throws people because it's really like a mixed use corridor of everything.
To me,
Per the definition, kind of what we're trying to define it as. But yeah, I think the lack of a main street is why we're thinking there's 10 main streets.
mhm.
But when I think of
The-
a main street, I don't think of a heavily congested corridor. I think more of like a Emmaus Main Street where it's more of a lazy drive-through as opposed to
Trees, lights.
Walbert, which is from 309 getting to Allentown. And, it is a very busy congested corridor. And
It's a hustle
And
and bustle.
And
don't
once again,
know.
I think it goes to everyone has their own concept of what Main Street is, because to me, Main Street is 4th Street in Hamburg, which is at once congested and also highly walkable, very visual. We all have these differing ideas in our heads as to what a corridor should be. So it's, the question becomes, do we include them all or do we get more selective? Because in the end, what this really is to me, it's just a pointer saying, hey, here's something that's a little outside the norm that we should examine in greater detail.
Or do we say the neighborhood corridors for the active transportation plan?
Oh, to like call them out.
Well,
I think we'll have
we have a
pedestrian
study to
corridors in.
base.
I think those are
Yeah.
two completely different topics.
I mean, to me, I could look at this and say, to me, Walbert, east of Cedar Crest, Broadway, and selected bits of Cedar Crest.
And Tillman.
Not Tillman. Well, Tillman, no, we've got Tillman basically as business district. And I kind of agree with that because that has a really different feel. I mean, you go to Tillman between Allentown and 309, and that is wide and not many trees. It's just, it doesn't, to me, feel visually appealing as a main street. It seems to be what they call a strode. It's something that is meant for cars, and people are secondary thoughts at best. Which is different from
100% of a secondary thought when I'm going for a run.
Yeah. So I think we all have different ideas about this. It's just what actually gets in the plan.
I mean, I guess I'm sorry again for taking up time, but that's what I worry about when we send this out for public comment. If there are people that look at this section in particular,
Yeah.
they come back and say, well, what about Parkway? What about all of Broadway? What about all of Walbert?
Yeah.
Right, because if we're
So-
looking at walkability, then we're taking very congested corridors to make them more walkable. But to your point, there's more neighborhoody roads that need attention by the township to provide safe access to known pedestrian frequented neighborhood corridors that currently exist that we need to work on.
But full circle, you're saying it's two different things.
Yeah. I think we will have a lot more areas, corridors identified in the active transportation plan that have very specific pedestrian oriented implementation out of that. This really has to do with the land use types, the development types that are there and changing.
And the other rationale for Walbert is connecting this building across 309 to the Ridge Farm and the business district. And then the idea of doing a corridor plan of looking at all these different types of uses and how they connect and what we can do zoning wise to enhance or protect certain character of that corridor. But I think what we're getting hung up on is the term neighborhood corridor, because I think it Parkway is like a neighborhood corridor because that's the pedestrian corridor or the traffic corridor for the neighborhood. So yeah, now
It's almost more of a Main Street corridor, but I don't really like the name of that either.
I think if we're looking for a main street, it shouldn't be 5 different ones. I think we should have a conversation about what logically makes sense to be the street or the place where we want to
Put our
call our,
investment.
right. And maybe it's not an entire stretch of wall, but maybe it is right here in front of the township building because this is the seat of the municipality.
And a library and everything else.
I don't know. Yeah.
And I guess, I mean, trying to get away from, the name and the calling it out as a land use category on its own. It's more of how do we get to the goal of this category, which in my mind is integration of residential and locally serving commercial. And how do we make sure that we are paying attention to that in zoning ordinances, transportation planning, where we have, I would say, these 5 or 6 unique areas where you have that, where you don't have longer stretches of commercial or major highways going through. You don't have closed off neighborhoods. You have these kind of, really it's unique to South Whitehall, or in some smaller neighborhoods in some of the surrounding communities. But we have a lot of these in South Whitehall, which is, I think, part of the beauty of this township. And we want to preserve that and improve that in ways that we need to. So I'm certainly open to a different kind of approach to that instead of a specific land use type, if that's kind of what everyone's getting wrapped up in.
Yeah, and it's because we have the place type as mixed use, or what's that? Okay. The neighborhood commercial is appropriate on these thoroughfares because they're busy and there's some existing commercial there, but we don't want to apply that use type to neighborhood residential. So we had to make some sort of distinction as to this is more appropriate along these main roads as opposed to along one of the smaller roads in the middle of that. So that's why it's a separate category.
Yeah. With Walbert east of Cedar Crest, as Chris mentioned, and as I deal with on a daily basis, there's 3 or 4 different zoning districts as you travel that way. And it is different from the neighborhoods, any of the roads behind it. It's a little different from most other roads in South Whitehall that you see a zoning district that's one lot deep. And I think that was the main trigger here. And we looked around and said, yeah, there are other similar places either already at that point or with some pressure to get to that point. And we kicked around which ones they would be. And this map kind of shows that.
Okay. Cognizant of the time, I want to give Mr. Kennedy, Mrs. Hodges time to speak.
We got 9 o'clock.
Because I don't think we're going to get through
Monica was
everything.
over here worried that,
According to that clock, it's 10 o'clock.
yeah, yeah. No, I'll be brief. I great opportunity this afternoon to meet with you guys. In 11 months, I've tried to get up to speed on what a comp plan he's in. When I say this to my wife, I said, it's not compensation, it's comprehensive. She always thinks it's compensation. I said, no, it's not. But in 11 months, I've tried to get up to speed on what the comp plan is. And as I said today, there's, soar with your strengths. People to my left and Brian and you guys have been on and the three of you have a lot more knowledge on the comp plan than I do today or ever will. And I believe that this will all be worked out. I hear what Brian and Diane are saying in terms, I believe all that. And I never thought of Walbert as a main street, but I know that ultimately the neighborhood corridor or the terminology will all be worked out. That's why we're here. You're asking for comments. And I think, Brian, your comment, you asked, like you said, you have to be right up front. I think there's smarter people in the room than I am who are going to work this out. I think overall, I like the idea of the plan. I like the idea that it's flexible, which is what David had brought up earlier. And Greg had brought up about, the areas with utilities and the infrastructure is going to determine a lot of what happens down the road. In 10 years, I don't want any of us having to be, somebody saying, yeah, when that Brian Hunt was on, Diane Kelly was on DOC and blah, blah, which I've heard. I said it today, knocking on doors, campaigning. I heard it a lot, and then and Greg was very. I asked about overlay. When does the overlay actually become a reality? It's not today or tomorrow. It could be a year, 5 or 6 years down the road. So he clarified a lot of that to me. So I'm happy with it. I work out the corridor situation. I don't really. I understand what you guys are saying, but I'm still have to wrap my head around that a little bit more. So. You're up.
I guess it's my turn. I couldn't get away with it, could I? I want to thank you all for all your really hard work. This is incredible. So thank you. And thank you for meeting with us. And as you remember, my big question was why on the northern end there was more industrial. You answered that, and I appreciate that. Just a couple things. I'm not going to beat the corridor thing to death, but I will say something about it. I just want to make sure that whatever we do decide, whether it's multiple, whether it's just one, that we do have a really nice design standard. I'm thinking hometown heroes and something really cheerful and community oriented for that. But most importantly, any corridor should have, safe crosswalks and traffic calming, and our pedestrians have to be safe. When I look at Broadway, especially the Dorney side, what would that be? The south side of Broadway with all those homes right against the road, and walking there and campaigning there was a nightmare. You never knew what was behind you, what was coming at you. So that's tricky, and certain parts of Walbert as well. So when I think of corridor, I do think of a way to have that safe walkability and have those nice crosswalks and have that design standard. So, and in terms of flexibility, I respect what you're saying about flexibility. My hope is that we don't have too much that we don't end up with something we don't want. And I know you are the experts, with that. So I trust that. And yeah, so that's it. But thank you.
I just have one more comment that I did bring up this afternoon. I know it's late after 9, is this township, and I'm speaking for me. Okay, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I said, what I heard was this township never wants to see another Ridge Farms come in again. Okay, like it or not, it's there. And how many people have told me, and Monica in our knocking on doors, you got to stop it. Well, that's not what we were here for. It's not why we were elected. It's not going to stop. It's going to happen. And what we want to do is move forward. And so that something like that doesn't bring out the townships to fill the Springhouse Auditorium again. And that's the only thing. And that's where I believe that the expertise in this room will get that so it doesn't happen. Thank you.
I'd like to address a few of these things. I just want you to all understand, realistically, this comprehensive plan does not lock you into anything. You have absolute control over what can happen after it's adopted. If you find something 2 years, 5 years down the line where this comprehensive plan prevents you from doing something, which I would find very hard to believe, but if it happens, you will be reviewing the comprehensive plan on a periodic basis. So that can be tweaked. So please don't get into the impression that this plan is either so flexible we can't do what we want, or so inflexible we can't do what we want. You have absolute control over everything. You could adopt this plan and do absolutely nothing. If that is your whim, you can do that. If you want to get into everything on the implementation on day one afterwards, that is your whim. You can do that. You know, this. Yeah, I just realized there are constraints to everything, but yeah. So realistically, I wouldn't put a lot of concern into this is what could we miss? What could we not be able to do? Because this plan is flexible and can be altered. So, you know, that's not your worry. This is really, I think we're quibbling about a lot of stuff that in the end, you'll find doesn't really matter. There are so many tools in the toolbox to accomplish this that I think almost every tool we've provided you can address all the problems of this township, known and unknown. It's all out there. If the corridor doesn't do it, the active transportation plan will do it. You know, it's like, that's what it is. I mean, we can quibble about what to call it, but in the end, when the rubber meets the road, we have to do something that tells us how do we fix this particular little problem. And we have given you lots of flexibility and lots of tools to accomplish that. So I just wanted to make sure that you understood that.
Most excellent, Greg. Thank you. And
You're the
thank you,
sweetest thing to
all of
say,
you.
Greg. That was
No, thank you
comments
for
there.
everyone for what you've presented to us. And as you said, for the flexibility that we have and the tools that we will have to move forward. Thank you.
That's why you're the closer. So,
Well,
affecting the time,
yes, so
we didn't get accomplished
no,
the whole agenda.
we have to figure out what to do with neighborhood corridor.
And if we have comments, we can email you. Or
Yeah, and I think we might send out some drafts
okay.
of how to handle it through email. I was looking at the calendar. The next workshop is 2 days before the planning commission meeting. There won't be time to incorporate any changes into the draft for that. So I don't know what that necessarily means, but the recommending for adoption at that planning commission meeting, we won't have a draft by then, because we still have to get through implementation. You wouldn't go that far.
We're down to a few specific items,
Okay.
which I think could be worked out via email, via conversation. So we could nail it down by then. So that
So
But we'll have it before.
I think paying attention to emails.
Sidebar.
I thought you had something to contribute, but
Yeah, actually,
No, we didn't have
you want
anything
to
to
share
share.
with the class?
You want to share with the
He
class?
was asking you the dates for the next planning commission meeting and if.
well, yeah, and Diane told me, if necessary, you'll have two commissioners. Diane's on planning VOC. Monica is going to come to the workshop, up to the planning commission. I would come, I will make it a point to come so that then you could have a dual.
So
At our next
Comp
planning meeting,
plan.
which is November 7th.
So we did, the planning commission opens it to public comment. The BOC doesn't need to be present for that.
No, I
Right,
think
you're
he's talking
saying-
about
Actually,
the parts that we didn't finish
the-
Oh,
tonight.
for the workshop.
Add it
finish,
to the agenda.
Right, if we added it to the
Then,
next week's
maybe
planning
like-
commission.
Oh, okay.
maybe the beginning of the meeting, and then
Got it. I see
And
what you're
then-
saying. At this
go into
upcoming,
your planning commission meeting. That's why, I was trying to work that out. So
Got
I
it.
would show up so you have
Got
three
it.
VOC.
at
and
the
your plan-
November planning commission
So you'd
meeting.
have the
Next week.
true comp plan meeting.
And we have it as an agenda item, as comprehensive plan update.
We do have it.
And if you could send it all out by email for comments tomorrow, we could send you our thoughts. At
So
least you'd get a draft together and
we
we could
have
speedily go through.
all of the let's talk about the implementation. We have all of the implementation items. What we wanted to cover tonight was if anything was missing on each of the implementation items or changes, tweaks to those implementation items.
I did find one error
So,
Can't find it right now.
no,
But I
not
will
now.
email it in.
Not
We
now.
actually updated, what you have in front of you is updated from what was sent out last week.
So
We
we will
went
send-
through it.
We will send the updated version tomorrow. The updated implementation items. If you see anything that you want clarification on or things added to, respond by email individually.
That's the one.
And we can incorporate that. for-
Implementation S3, DADED.
EADED.
Typo, DCED.
It should be DCED.
Where are you?
It's just a typo.
Oh,
Should be DCED.
or DEP, DCED. It's one of them.
Right.
Yeah.
But dead is not dead.
Yeah.
Zed is not
Oh.
dead.
Yes, it's email.
I saw that too. I was just.
So, and then we'll probably take a couple days to digest neighborhood corridor and come up with a strategy for that. That'll come next week and we'll have to figure out how to handle that.
I just want to make a few comments on implementation as you're looking through them. So everything is laid out with the goals and the actions, the stakeholders, that the funding sources is identified in here. And really what that means is in areas where we think there might be a need for funding to pursue that implementation item or do something directly with that, that's where we've identified funding sources. Because for some of them, you'll see not applicable, whereas there might be funding needed long-term, but we're looking at, is there funding needed as a limiting step to begin that implementation item? The other thing to consider as we're looking through this list of 25 is that a lot of these may occur at the same time or as part of one plan. But what we wanted to do was make sure that we were addressing specific actions and needs for these items. A good example is the transportation plan and the active transportation plan. They might be the complementary plans. It might be one plan. It might be really what we're looking at is the need for the transportation plan is more of inventorying what we have, a lot of the concepts that we've talked about of, looking at truck routes, that sort of thing. And then another component of this, we talked about the need for looking into Act 209. We see this as being kind of our first step into the feasibility of something like that. And then the active transportation plan would be kind of a follow-up to that. Once we have the data gathered from the transportation plan, looking at what are the specific implementable policies of where the specific corridors we want to highlight, how are we looking at funding infrastructure improvements and what those would be.
So, you'll see there's some overlap, and like agriculture plan and open space plan may end up being in the same plan, but these were born out of working group recommendations and things that we picked up during the process. So we kind of highlighted them individually. So be aware, and how we're going to roll them out, we still have to work through that. We'll put these into like a project management, and we'll have like Gantt charts and things on how we're going to roll them out. But that's after.
And the timeline and priority, thank you to those who responded to the survey about each one of these and where they fit in kind of the timeline priority. We kind of, some of them were different answers. We kind of looked at what was appropriate to combine. The other thing that we considered here is some of the things with where they might not have shown up as maybe like a high priority or short-term timeline, for example, in maybe what was looked at as the like the measurement of success. There might be some other factors associated with that as far as requirements, state requirements, that sort of thing, or the need to complete one study before the next, whereas it would be, short-term high priority, but there might be another plan that goes ahead of that. So we did make some adjustments there. If you have any questions about that, just feel free to highlight it and reach out, and we can talk about, some of the other factors that might influence the prioritization of these items.
Okay.
I think of like DEP requirements and things like that we might have to.
So are we good? I have one question. I don't know what their role is. Michael Baker International, Hannah's not here. Are they done with us or?
She was working the polls tonight.
Okay. But I know they were a consultant, so
Yeah, so they're helping put the plan together, and then also going to help with the public comment period.
Okay.
We've been able to handle, I should say, Chris has been able to handle a lot of the writing and putting the plan together in-house. So we're saving some consulting dollars that way and applying it to more of the design. So,
As a taxpayer, I appreciate that.
yes.
Great.
Yes. I used to work in small business, so that's very important to me.
Is anybody up here have any further comment or questions or anything? For the
As-
good of the order?
Sorry, as we're all noodling on the neighborhood corridor thing, can you, and I'm sorry, but can you find maybe some examples of neighborhood corridors in townships? Because back to the Lidditz thing, there's Lidditz Borough and Warwick Township. And to me, we're more like a Warwick Township, not a borough. But then I think about Citronia is more borough-esque.
Right.
So
And
maybe
I
that's.
would look at Coopersburg
So, and then
for a borough, like it's.
Dublin,
I was just-
I don't know if anybody's been down to Dublin, PA. So
Yes,
they
I know very
did,
well.
they have a major state road going right through the middle of town. They've done a lot of development adjacent to that road, sidewalks, really nice tap room, highly recommended.
I'll check it out
So they've done
tomorrow.
a lot of redevelopment in there along a state route. So that's kind of one thing that I think about Walbert as a possibility. So if anybody's driving around.
We also, we can also share, I think a couple of years ago, we had the Penn Praxis did a study on Walbert, and there's some concepts in there that just to give some examples. I think there's a lot of things that are a little too high level for what we're talking about, but
Well, and people look at that and they said, that's not South Whitehall.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's, understand. All
Okay,
right,
sorry, I'm done.
good? Are we all good? We're over time. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I hear a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
God forgive you if you say no.
This
Thank you,
conference will
everyone.
now be recorded.